We now begin some lecture on cognitive perspectives. We are what we think. We place this within a number of key perspectives we've looked at. We've considered the psychoanalytic Freud, which considers that our personality is created through unconscious drives like id. We've considered a number of neo-analytic theorists like Jung, like Erikson, like Horney, like Adler, who really do rest a bit more on the social interactions and the seeking of the bigger self. We talked about the behaviorist paradigm. Personality is created through rewards and punishers. And we talked about biology. Personality is in our genes and our biological makeup. We've talked about trait theories, that we just have these certain consistent traits that manifest. And so now we're coming to these cognitive theories. Personality is created through our patterns of thought. In this chapter, or a couple of weeks that we'll be taking on cognitive theories of personality, we're going to look at a number of key theorists. And first among these will be Kurt Lewin. He's considered the father of social psychology, and what we'll be looking at specifically from him is what he calls field theory. And we'll look at Dr. Julian Rotter. He's the theorist. We'll be looking primarily at locus of control, and you'll have a short reading from Dr. Rotter's work. We'll be talking about Dr. Bandura. In fact, you'll read a chapter about him, and primarily we'll look at his ideas around self-efficacy in addition to what we've already looked at. We'll look at Fritz Heider. He works with attribution theory or explanations for our behavior, and cognitive distortions, or the bias that we impose into our thinking about things. We will probably, but not certainly, cover Dr. George Kelly, who gives us ideas around something he calls constructive alternativism, a fun little task we can do, but we'll see if we decide to do it. And then in our more modern times, we have Dr. Martin Seligman, who kind of follows up on Dr. Beck's cognitive distortions, talking about our personality tendencies toward optimism or pessimism bias. And finally, Dr. Carol Dweck, whose work on mindset you might already be familiar with, but it never hurts to go a little further with this. So as we move past these ideas, let's consider this setting, just sort of a big scenario from a conference of some sort. And we know that all these individuals are in the same room at the same time. And we also could probably answer the question that they are all experiencing something different. And what is it that's causing them to be experiencing something different, even though they're in the same room at the same time? So we'll maybe start with this in class. So what we'll be considering in this content is an idea of Gestalt, and we'll talk about what this is. So cognitive theories rest on Gestalt theories, or the recognition that when our minds fill in gaps when we face incomplete information. So we never have complete information. Our mind is always filling in gaps. Even as you look around you right now, you'll see that there are some things that are behind other things, preventing your senses from perceiving what is actually there, and yet your mind fills in the blanks and lets you know, oh, that's a chair. I know it's a chair, and I know it has legs, even though the legs are underneath the table. That's the idea, a bit of an idea of Gestalt. So all of reality is incomplete and subject to interpretation. So how does your mind fill in the blanks? Is it different from mine? Interpretations are based on sensing, and by this we just mean using our senses, eyes, ears, nose, etc. Filtering, pushing aside irrelevant information, perceiving, and responding. Our cognitive styles then are the habits with which we interpret information. So each of us organizes the information in the world around us differently. These categories matter, and we'll see that at the end when we look with the role construct repertory. We all place different levels of importance on what our senses take in and what we perceive. So the salience of it is impacted by our thoughts and impacts our thoughts. We control our attention differently. And we differ in the cognitive complexity we can handle. So how many details are we capable of taking in and processing at one time? And we differ in the lens that we apply. For example, optimism is a characteristic that we'll talk about as an explanatory style within this cluster of material. A little bit more on Gestalt. So Gestalt is a pattern or configuration that is subject to interpretation. You can see this image in the lower left of the screen. If you look at it from one perspective, you might see 8 black dots. If you look at it from another perspective, you might see a 3-dimensional box. If you look at it from yet another perspective, you might see a piece of paper with holes half popped out of it, and on top of a box. And so there are a lot of different ways of seeing this image, and our mind looking at this ambiguous image has to make sense of it. And how do we do that? Well, our mind completes the blanks for us. In something like this, you might even be able to notice your perceptions switching back and forth between seeing the box and seeing the dots, or seeing the hole in the paper in front of the box. A lot of times this happens. So your mind fills in the blanks, and none of those are there. There are no complete black dots on the paper. Your mind's filling that information in. There is no cube on the paper. Your mind's filling that in as well. So this is the process of Gestalt. So we know, for example, that there is sky behind these buildings, and that these buildings are 3-dimensional and deep enough for someone to go into, even though they look like walls. We seek meaning in our environment through our senses. And again, when we say sensing in psychology, we just mean our actual senses: eyes, ears, touch, smell, sight, sound, and taste. Sometimes we consider our intuitive processes to be included in this. We organize our sense information, or our sensation, into perceptions, giving them meaning. And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and can't be reduced. So this building is made up of whatever features that the building has in it, many, many features. And if we would not, the parts that went into it before they made the building were less than the building itself. We can't take it apart again. And this cookie is a good example of that. This cookie is made up of flour and sugar and butter and eggs and chocolate chips and a couple other ingredients, but the cookie is more than that. If we gave you all those ingredients and lined them up in front of you, you would not eat it. But mixed up, baked, and so forth, it's a cookie. The Gestalt, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And likewise, we consider that we humans, if we look at the elements and in our body, we know what our body is made up of, and yet we consider that the individual, even if we took all of those things in those exact proportions, we knew that as a human being, we would have a greater individual than just the sum of all those ingredients. So let's consider here a model of attention, which I think some, especially in the cognitive theories, could argue is our most valuable resource, more valuable than our families, than our money, than our time. This is our attention. This is what others want the most from us. And so how does it work? Broadbent offers us a simple model of attention. First off, the steps of attention. Initially, we sense something in our environment. There's something that we pick up on amongst all those different stimuli we see. And maybe we pick up on it through our 5 senses, like our ears, eyes, mouth, hands, taste. But maybe we also pick it up just through our internal bodily processes. Maybe our digestion has bothered us, or our heart rate has increased, or something like that. That can also be a source of stimuli. And we can also get things just from our thoughts. Like we can get ourselves very worked up and place our full attention only on our thoughts. So we sense something in our environment in one of those ways. Next, what we do is we filter those stimuli. And so we decide where we're going to place our attention. And this can happen automatically. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. You might think of, let's say, if you're at a lecture and suddenly your stomach tells you you need to use the restroom, well, that's where you're going to place your attention and take action. And so automatically that can happen. Our body or other things can place demands on us, sometimes even intrusive thoughts, but we also do this intentionally. If we have something that's hurting, either emotional pain or physical pain, we can decide to do something else to divert ourselves. So that's the filtering process. Next, we perceive, and what that just means is giving meaning to the information that we've selected in step 2. So we can give meaning to it through thinking. We've learned how to interpret certain things, or we've learned information that allows us to give meaning to certain events. But this can also happen through our emotions, our conditioned responses that might not be something that we've learned through cognitive processes. So now we have information coming in, but we're deciding what to pay attention to in step 2, and now we attribute meaning to it, and finally we respond to it. So we react to the meaning we've ascribed to the stimulus by maybe storing information in memory, for good or for bad. Maybe learning to approach or avoid a situation that's benefited or harmed us. Maybe we react by acting physically or in any variety of other ways, but we respond. And so the bigger meaning in all of this is that there is no common single human experience. Everybody is standing at their own vantage points and viewing things through their own distorted lenses. So let's give a little thought to where we were. In our last chapter, Behaviorism, we were talking about actions, and now we're going to be talking about thoughts. So let's look at the connection there. So behaviorism, remember, Skinner and others thought that all we can really know is what we can observe. And that's true about other people. And we know that actions, if we repeat them, become habits, and that habits, the way we spend our time, the things we're doing, can become our personality. But what causes the actions that we do? And that's something that's largely remains unanswered in behaviorist paradigms. It's all thought to be through reinforcers, but we forget about one major piece in that paradigm. First off, we forget about attention. What is a person focusing on? 2 people can watch the very same event, and one can have a negative interpretation and the other can have a positive interpretation. On what stimulus does an individual choose to focus? Perception refers to the meaning that we ascribe to that stimulus. And so what meaning do we ascribe? That would make a difference in how we subsequently act. And then finally, self-regulation. How do we choose to respond to that meaning? And so even if we have a long conditioned response, say, to be fearful of a certain type of human being, a certain type of man or woman, say, so first off, maybe our attention is drawn to it from an emotional place that's hard to control. And maybe we ascribe meaning to it that's linked to a negative meaning. But as we become aware of that meaning, how do we regulate our behavior? Maybe we become aware of the emotion we're feeling and we opt not to act, or we opt to take proactive stances against not giving in to the emotions that arise. One thing to note is that our legal system concerns itself only with actions, sometimes with intentions, but actions is all the legal system really looks at. Some wisdom-based teachers focus on the roots of action. What are the thoughts that underlie the action, and how have we placed our attention? Quoting the Dalai Lama, be careful of your thoughts, they become your words. Be careful of your words, they become your actions. Be careful of your actions, they become your habits. Be careful of your habits, they become your character. Be careful of your character, it becomes your destiny. he might say then that we shape our lives and our futures through our thoughts. A similar perspective can be heard in this short little video by Wally Brown, about 6 minutes long, that we'll play in class, and I'll also post up here for us. But it's a very similar perspective. It's our thoughts that make us who we are, and this is coming from our Navajo historian, Wally Brown. So our thoughts have power. So how does all of this happen? What are the mechanisms? Let's just take a minute to look at cognition in the brain. This is another short little video that I'll enjoy playing for you in class, but in a nutshell, it gives support to the notion that the more we follow a mental pathway by thinking about something or by reacting, the stronger that pathway becomes. Grounding it in our neural framework, we know that within our entire nervous system, we have neurons, the type of cells called neurons that have been with us since before we were born. Those cells they do die, but the ones that we have are typically were born and shaped and connected in even during our prenatal days when we were still in the womb. They're very old, older than we ourselves are. And just to restate, we know that information comes into a neuron through dendrites. There are receptors on the dendrites, travels, if there's enough neurotransmitter to trigger an electrical response, then that electrical signal travels through the axon to the end, to its axon terminals, where there's a gap. And the gap is represented here by this black dot. And you can see that there's a space there where a neurotransmitter is released, which in turn signal the next neuron. Another signal is transmitted and released. And those are essentially how our neural networks work. However, what happens with repeated thoughts and habits? Something called long-term potentiation is what goes on. So let's orient a little bit to this diagram. What we're looking at up on top is the end of a neuron. This right here is the gap where the neurotransmitter is released, and these are the chemical signals that, if there are enough of them, they will trigger a depolarization, which causes a release of an electrical signal in the next neuron. So these neurons communicate, there's a signal, and this black line on the bottom represents the likelihood of this second neuron firing in response to this first neuron's trigger of neurotransmitter. So make note of the number of receptors, only 3. Make note of the number of neurotransmitter vesicles. There are 5, and a handful of neurotransmitter chemicals. Now, what happens after repeated stimulation, or we might say after thinking the same thought or the same pattern of thoughts again and again? Look what happens in the neurons a week later. We see increase in neurotransmitter and increase in receptor, and consequently, there's an increased likelihood of that same pathway firing again. And the more we think that thought or that pattern of thoughts, the stronger that pathway becomes and the more likely it is to fire in the future. Looking at this through another way, we know that long-term potentiation in this diagram, we still have the neurotransmitter vesicles and we have the neurotransmitter chemicals. We have the receptors in yellow and the dendrite of the receiving neuron. In image 2, you can see what happens through repeated thoughts. The neurotransmitters being released, but look what's happened. The receiving neuron is now having more receptors. It's got to do that to deal with increases in neurotransmitter, which makes it more likely to fire. In consequence of that, we have an increase in the neurotransmitter chemicals that are produced on that pathway. Now we have more likelihood that these receptors will be signaled and the postsynaptic neuron will fire. And then finally, we have increases in the vesicles that are producing these neurotransmitters. And so that's how our brain changes in response to our thoughts. It's kind of cool. So Hebb's law, neurons that fire together, wire together, our thinking shapes our existence. And we can see here this deep thinking. Perhaps this young person is ruminating on something negative that happened in the past, or maybe this young person is solving the technological problems of the future. We don't know. But that's where he's placing his or her attention, and that's the pathway that will be strengthened. And this person on this side seems to be very distracted, not placing their attention on any one particular thing. They're diffusing their energy across all of these many ways. And so it's not likely that there's going to be a strong pathway connected through this diffusion of attention. So that's the end of what we have as an overview.